My name is Douglas Kellner. I'm the George F. Kneller Chair in the Philosophy of Education at UCLA. I've been there the last 3 years. In 1973, I was hired at the University of Texas in Austin, and I taught in the philosophy department there for 20-some years. I've also taught in Taiwan, in Finland, in Sweden. I've been in schools of communication, sociology, philosophy, education, so I consider myself transdisciplinary.
Let's just start from the very top and have you tell us a little bit about the hidden curriculum and how you understand it, and start from there.
Well, if you look at the notion of the hidden curriculum in schooling, you'll see that the hidden curriculum is the status quo, that all societies use education to reproduce the dominant social order. This is true throughout history. Our society is a capitalist society, so schooling, education, the hidden curriculum reproduces a capitalist social system. To start off, let's consider the space and the structure of schooling. What happens? You go from the public or the private space of the home into the public space of the school. You enter a schoolyard, you hear a school bell ring, and you go into the class. Well, this is just like factory in the workplace, where you leave home and you go to work every day. At a certain time, you have to be in the office. So schooling structures individuals to accept the space, the discipline, the structure of work. From the time that the bell rings, you go into homeroom, you sit there for an hour or so, the bell rings again, you go out in the hall, you then go to your first class, then the second class. And if you think of the workday, it's structured the same way. You go to work, you check in. I mean, you used to literally punch in. I've worked in factories during the old days where the day is structured just like the school day. All right? Then when you sit in the classroom and you look at the social relations of the classroom, it's between teacher and student. That's the same social relations as boss and worker, where the teacher has the authority. You're the student. You submit to authority. So that's part of what schooling is about, is to accept the structure and the discipline of the social relations of authority and to get people to submit to workplace relations. Consider also things like grading, exams, etc. It's to create a hierarchical social order, to get people to submit to competition, to success. So just like schooling, you have grades, you have SAT classes or SAT exams, you have grade point averages. That's to get you to submit to, condition for the structure of the work world, where you will compete for money, for honors, for rewards. So you learn competition and success in the school place as well. So you see that this hidden curricula having to do with the structure and the space of schooling, how to do with the social relationships and authority relationships, as well as the content of exams and competition. It's preparing you for work in the broader social order. In fact, in the 1950s, I went to high school in Long Island, and we had a tracking system there, where you take an exam as you go into high school, and depending how you score, you either went into the honors program or the college program or the more sort of clerical workers program or the shop and home ec program. This is replicating the class structure. So you're getting prepared already in high school for your place in the class structure. If you're a member of the privileged class and you score well on the exams, you're getting ready for an elite place in society. You'll go to college, you see yourself as part of the privileged elite. So class relations are replicated in the structure of schooling, as well as gender and race. I mean, this is all part of the hidden curricula, that males are the dominant authority figures, whites are the dominant race. Having said this, I have to say that in the last several decades, there's been social contestation. There's been a contesting of the dominant social order, which has to do with gender, race, and class hierarchies. So on one hand, schools reproduce these hierarchies, but on the other hand, they contest them. There are teachers there are students who are contesting the dominant social order. So a lot of women, for instance, in schools have been influenced by the feminist movement, or because of the feminist movement, a certain amount of women have been able to attain positions of authority, so that these women sometimes just replicate the dominant conservative social order and are representatives, like, say, Margaret Thatcher, or conservative corporate businesswomen, or conservative school teachers. They replicate the same authority relationship, the same power relationships that you had earlier in a more conservative society that kept women out. And likewise with people of color. Sometimes they're just representatives of the dominant social order, are as authoritarian, as conservative as the previous white power structure, but not always. You have some women who are themselves contesting the dominant social order and are creating alternative structures of education, pedagogies, etc. In fact, the final point I want to say about the hidden curricula has to do with the structure of the curricula itself. Things like economics, political science, history, the disciplines. Some of them simply replicate the status quo. They present a conservative view of the economy, of the political system, of the social system, of American history, but not always. Some teachers, some textbooks, some people that construct curricula, they have a more liberal, a more multicultural, a more alternative curricula, so that they are presenting different views of the economy, of the social system. They're contesting it. They maybe have more democratic, more multicultural views than the previous conservative people doing curricula.
You were talking a little bit about the physical environment. Can you tell us, maybe give us some examples as to how the physical environment in higher education, the university, kind of has examples of the hidden curriculum or implicit ideas of the larger society?
Well, I've told you about the very structure of the school is a space that you enter from your private homes through the streets into the arena of the school, where they have fences around it, they have doors, they have hallways that are monitored and controlled, etc. So it's similar to a factory where you're going into an ordered, a structured, and ultimately a hierarchical space. So you walk into the classroom and you submit to the discipline of the teacher. The teacher stands in the front of the classroom. You sit in chairs. The teacher is lecturing to you. You're a more passive recipient of the teacher's knowledge or wisdom, etc. Just like you go to work and you submit to the organization of the workplace. You go to your little cubicle, to your desk, to your workplace, and you submit to the authority of the boss, the foreman, the social hierarchy there. So there's a similar structure, a similar space to the workspace and to the classroom.
Okay. Are there examples of space that resist that, as far as you know?
Well, you have alternative schools. Some of them see space as very important. So you sit around in a circle rather than have a classroom situation. You have more of a dialogical situation. There are alternative pedagogies that challenge the hidden curricula, that challenge the structure of the classroom, the structure of social relations and hierarchy. Paulo Freire, for instance, in his book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, argues for alternative pedagogies, alternative social relations in the classroom, and this means alternative spaces. So as I said, you have a more dialogical situation where education is a dialogue between students and teachers. It's less authoritarian. Students can actually teach the teachers. Teachers can learn from students, which particularly in a media culture, a technological culture, makes perfect sense. Because often teachers know more about media, they know more about technologies than the teachers. So you can actually learn from the students if you open yourself up to non-hierarchical relationships, and a different pedagogy and a different way of teaching. So I think it's very important in talking about hidden curricula, in analyzing, critiquing, uncovering the hidden curriculum that is the dominant curriculum, but also talking about how we can construct alternatives, how we can resist it, how we can reconstruct education, how we can construct different spaces, different pedagogies, different social relations, and different curricula, how we can have a more democratic notion of education, a more multicultural, where we bring in the cultural experiences of groups of individuals that have been left out of the dominant curricula, challenging the canon, bringing in literatures, for instance, from blacks reading black women like Toni Morrison or Alice Walker or Sandra Cisneros or any number of writers that are often left out of the mainstream curricula, taking seriously film, television, music as alternative forms of education. Today, the internet, cyberspace, bringing that into the classroom and into education, challenging again the dominant organization of curricula that is book-oriented, that is teacher-student hierarchically structured, as opposed to a more interactive and dialogical situation.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the way that the faculty is kind of a little bit more about the elements of professionalization in academia and the way that the implicit understandings that are embedded in the process of making an academic person?
Right. Well, teachers are as much, if not more, a product of the hidden curriculum than students. Students tend to resist this hierarchical, authoritarian, conformist, boring structure of education, of the classroom, of the social relations between teachers and students. Students often tune out of this because they're bored, they're oppressed, etc., whereas the teachers are the enforcers. The teachers are the ones that represent the dominant social order and are enforcing the hidden curricula. They're the enforcers because they're a product of the social system. They've been socialized to see education in these terms, where they have to draw up their lesson plan, how they have to follow the textbook, how they have to follow a certain social science or English literature curriculum, etc. So they're often conservative representatives of the status quo because they themselves have been socialized in higher education to think that's what education is, that that's their social role, that that's their job. And often teachers that resist this are fired. I mean, I've had students at the University of Texas that went into schooling that tried to teach different versions of American history or social science, who were fired for not following the lesson plan, the textbook that was adopted in the school, for bringing in films or the internet or new technology and trying to reconstruct education and doing it different. So often teachers are, one, the product of their own socialization, and two, themselves subject to the discipline of labor, where if they don't fit into whatever system they find themselves working in, are subject to the penalties like getting fired or disciplined by conservative school administration.
Can you tell us maybe some stories about yourself as you went, because you went through the socialization process as we are going through it as well. And just tell some stories as to how you think you became socialized to do what you do.
Well, I'm a product of the 1960s in terms of my politics. I grew up in the 1950s, and I was socialized like everyone into conservative, middle-class American politics and ideology. But in the 1960s, I experienced all the movements of the era, starting with the student movement and the anti-war movement that was very anti-authoritarian, where we questioned everything. So we started constructing alternative education in the 1960s. I was going to graduate school studying philosophy at Columbia University in 1965 when the student movement originated. In 1968, the students took over Columbia University and made it stop. So we set up alternative classrooms, alternative education, etc., where we decided what we wanted to read. We sit out in the grass at Columbia University in a circle and discuss. So I had models of alternative education going back to the 1960s, and also read books like Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed that taught us different relationships between students and teachers. So everyone's a product of their own experience. I just happen to have the experience of the 1960s and the 1970s that made me critical of the dominant system and made me seek out alternatives to that system, which I experienced as a young person. And I like those, so I've been trying to develop alternative models of pedagogy, critiques of the hidden curriculum, of the existing social order, the existing system of education from that time forward.
Can you tell us a little bit about, you've done some writing on the role of the intellectual in education. Can you tell us a little bit about how you see the role of the intellectual either changing or remaining the same within what's happening right now in the world capitalist system?
Well, it's very important for teachers to see themselves as intellectuals. A lot of teachers just see themselves as functionaries or bureaucrats, or they're just doing a job. But in point of fact, teachers are engaged in intellectual labor. They themselves are intellectuals, reproducing ideas. And if they're good intellectuals, they're critical intellectuals, where they're critical of the dominant ideas in the society. They're creative. They try to think for themselves. They seek out alternatives. They seek enlightenment, truth. They're constantly growing, developing. They're trying to be good intellectuals. So it's very important, I think, for teachers to see themselves as intellectuals and to become critical intellectuals. But it's equally important to see the relationship between intellectuals and technology. So traditionally, intellectuals were writers, were readers, and they were related to books in a very intimate way. Schooling was founded on books. The curriculum was a print curriculum. This, by the way, is part of the hidden curriculum of thinking that textbooks are the vehicle of education, that print literacy, reading and writing and arithmetic, is the goal of education. Well, again, that's just reproducing the dominant technology that was print technology from the Renaissance up to the last several decades. So that previously intellectuals were experts at print technology. They were readers, they were writers, they were teachers of the written word. Well, we're now in a media society, so it's very important for teachers to see that education is being radically and dramatically transformed, not by themselves in the classroom, but one by the media society, by the fact that since the end of World War II, but starting earlier in the 20th century, our culture became a media culture. This is the title of one of my books, 1995 Routledge book called Media Culture. And I take this concept very, very seriously. We are a media culture. We're not a book culture. We're not a school culture. We're not a church culture. We're not a family culture. We're a media culture, where the media is the center of our symbol system, of our culture, starting with film, then radio, comic books, magazines throughout the 20th century, but with television that becomes the center of life. And at its high point, television was watched 8 hours a day. I mean, this is almost impossible to imagine that a cultural force, television, could be so central to a culture. We now have computers and the internet and a variety of media, film, music, etc. The point being that in a media culture, media is a dominant pedagogy. Media is teaching people how to see the world. It's teaching people role models, values, social behavior. It's giving people education about life, the economy, the social structure, history, etc. People are becoming socialized by a media culture. Previously, film, television, music were the dominant forms of media culture. Now cyberculture, the internet, computers are becoming equally, if not more important. So connecting this with the intellectuals and with schooling, it's important to see that our students ourselves are being socialized and educated by media culture. And it's important for educators to be able to themselves construct a counter-pedagogy, to become critical of the media culture and what it's teaching, and to present alternative versions, but also to be able to use media culture as a mode of education, to use videos, to use films, to use computers, to use multimedia, etc., as teaching tools. So this requires teachers as intellectuals to learn how to at least use media and computers, if not themselves, make videos, make film, produce multimedia, construct websites as modes of education.
Actually, I'm going to jump in here.
Okay.
Can you speak to us a little bit about the notion of how our media cultures are changing, where we're moving from all of the media that have proceeded from print up until the net as a one-to-many model of communication, where we are being educated by the media, versus what we're seeing now, which is more of a many-to-many model, where perhaps, in an idealistic version, everybody's educating everybody, and how that might have an impact on what on the curriculum.
And if you can't give the response to me,
Okay.
so that the video will be edited.
Right. Now, when we look at media culture, we look at the hidden curriculum, we look at schooling today, it's important to see the multiplicity of media that are involved in our education, in our socialization, and to be able to use all of these media as tools of education. Let me try to spell this out a little bit. As I said earlier, traditionally we were a book culture. Print media and print literacy were the heart of culture and the heart of what education was all about. So developing literacy, becoming educated, was learning to read and write books, print literacy. Then with film and television, suddenly, at least the culture as large was becoming socialized by the media. That television, film, popular music, the forms of media culture were perhaps more potent and more powerful socializers than, say, book culture was. And most educators never got this. We went through decades of media culture without most educators figuring out how important media culture was in terms of having its own curriculum and in terms of presenting a challenge to education to, one, be able to critique and analyze media culture, and then two, being able to use it positively in the classroom. Now, things are much more complicated today because the media culture is being transformed by a computer culture, by an info culture, that as we have new computer technologies, there's new cultural spaces, the internet, that are even maybe more salient, more important in young people's lives than, say, film or television. On the other hand, we're in such a complex media culture that all of this stuff is interacting. So we still have print culture, we still have books, we still have television and radio and film and popular music, but we also have computer culture. So this complicates literacy and education tremendously. In fact, in an ironic way, print literacy, print media via the internet are more important today than they have been the last several decades, where the media culture was basically visual media oriented and centric. In other words, I would say film and television and popular music that itself has become a media spectacle through MTV, through rock films, through rock concerts, etc., have been. In other words, for the last several decades, our media culture tended to be a culture of the spectacle. It tended to be multimedia. It tended to be visual. And in an ironic way, with the internet, print media has had a comeback. In other words, we do email. We read websites. We spend more time interacting with print media today than I think the last generation did in media culture, so that we need in schooling today to put more of an emphasis than ever on print literacy, on traditional skills of reading and writing, at the same time that we have to develop new literacies. We have to develop media literacy. We have to become competent, literate in watching, analyzing, criticizing film, television, music, cyberculture. We have to become computer literate. In order to access the internet, in order to interact with the new forms of multimedia, we need to gain new media skills. So this is a tremendous challenge for education that I think very few educators have really grasped. I think young people and students are more aware of this than some of the older generation, that to be educated today, to be media competent today, to be a player in the culture and the economy, you have to have a wide range of skills ranging from print media literacy and competency to media culture, visual culture like film and television competency and literate to computer literate. That's why I argue that today education requires multiple literacies. We need to gain print, multimedia, media literacies. It's a big challenge for education.
Now, the story usually goes that with this new event of the internet, the people are losing the type of focus that it takes to read an entire book, that it takes to be able to write, to understand critically. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's a big challenge to traditional culture that started with film and radio, intensified with television, and is now even more dramatic with computers and the internet. And that is, as you say, fragmentary culture, more speeded up culture, more visual culture, more multimedia and spectacular culture. That's a big challenge to traditional culture that was either a print culture, I'm talking about high culture, that involved literature, poetry, book culture, or the ability to look at abstract paintings, to follow operas or plays or other forms of traditional high culture. This form of culture is challenged and has been challenged throughout the 20th century by the new media, by film that's much more rapid, much more visual, much more spectacular. Radio already began fragmentary culture, where you had 15-minute radio programs that went from ads to the descriptions by the announcers to the soap opera or the drama, etc., that was very, very fragmentary. Well, the fragmentation was even intensified more by television. There was also a more visual medium, and people that have analyzed the structure of television see that the cuts become faster and faster. MTV is the model of television culture that involves very flashy images, very fast editing, very fragmentary forms of culture, and it's the same thing in the internet, in websites, in multimedia, etc. So the attention span of people socialized in this culture becomes smaller and smaller, less and less. So simply this is a challenge to traditional high culture, to traditional book culture, to forms of complex media like opera, theater, classical music, different forms of high culture that a lot of young people have trouble relating to because they are conditioned to relate to very fast, very intense, and very visual multimedia culture. So it's simply a challenge for educators, for intellectuals to themselves to be able to train students to be able to appreciate these other forms of culture, but also to more intelligently relate to film, television, and this internet and the new forms of media and cyberculture.
Do you see, excuse me, my throat. Do you see this new way of understanding younger generation, do you see that as being categorically different than other? In other words, is there a true break, or is it just part of the same way of learning and knowing?
It seems to me, in looking at contemporary culture, society, education, whatever you look at, you see both continuities, but also I would stress discontinuities with the past. So on one hand, as I've been arguing, this fragmentation of culture, this development of multimedia, this pedagogy from media, from the culture, from the environment, has been accelerating throughout the 20th century. I mentioned film, radio, television, cyberculture as successive developments of new cultural forms that are a challenge to the previous culture. So on one hand, the challenge to traditional education, to book culture, to print media literacy has been developing throughout the last couple centuries. On the other hand, with every new medium, there is something new. Film brought a new visual media in it, brought editing. Radio brought in a more fragmentary form of culture. Television brought in a tremendous involving fragmentary form of culture that we've barely been able to figure out. A potency, a all-embracive fascination and seductiveness that was unparalleled, really. And now computers and cyberculture are bringing something yet new, something yet more fascinating and seductive. So there's differences with each new medium, with each new cultural form that are difficult to figure out and that are, again, a challenge to education and to us.
Now, how are these new mediums then affecting the university in terms of how it's structured and how learning is occurring?
Well, computers are probably the most revolutionary force of the 20th century that are simply changing everything. They're changing work, they're changing media, they're changing culture, they're changing education, so that the university is being radically and dramatically restructured because of computers, whether they like it or not. Television never and film never really created much of a restructuring or a remodeling of education. That eventually video was brought into the classroom. First, there was tremendous resistance to bringing television, for instance, into the classroom. With the normalization of VCRs, where everyone had a VCR in their classroom, and first of all in their home, and then eventually in their classroom, soon or eventually teachers brought video, film, television into the classroom, where it became normalized. But it really didn't change education all that much. All right, it was just used as something supplemental and incidental to the work of education that was basically pedagogy through books, through classroom interaction between students and teachers. Whereas with the internet, with computers, you really have a dramatic restructuring of education in terms of research, in terms of transmission of ideas. In other words, students themselves interact through email, through chat rooms, through interactive websites, etc. So it's a very different relationship to knowledge and information than book learning. On the other hand, there is that continuity of print media. They're still doing it through reading, writing, through print media, even though it's in the broader field of computers. On the other hand, the internet is more multimedia. So they're accessing music, graphics, more and more video, film, etc., multimedia through the internet. That's going to change education even more. So already if you look at the libraries, they've been computerized. If you look at the web, the internet, it is the great library. All right? It used to be you went to the library to get the great books, to get the journals, etc. You can now get them through your home, through the internet. So this is a dramatic, on one level, restructuring of education and knowledge. Now, it hasn't changed the classroom and certain traditional forms of pedagogy, relationships between students and teachers, but I think it will. I think more and more teachers are going to use websites, they're going to use listservs, they're going to interact with their students through the internet, which is, by the way, a more dialogical form of education. It's not just lecturing to the students in the classroom, but it's interacting with the students on a somewhat more egalitarian level through dialogue on the internet.
One of the things that Peter was talking about was, I think he called it the colonization of the market into the university. And if I understood him right, one of the ways that this was happening was through technology, because as we get more and more plugged in to the computer, it's very similar to a television, and you can really place ads in everything you do. And this happens here at ASU when you click on the library. When you click on the library, you actually automatically get this AOL sign that wants
Right.
you to sign on, and
Right.
or when you just as soon as you log into the web, you're automatically being targeted as to sell you something.
Right.
How do you bring together the technology and the market and trying to create a critical understanding of what's happening to you as it's happening to you? Does that make any sense?
It makes total sense. It's a totally important question, and it's very complex to analyze the relationships between capitalism, the market, business, and technology. And here's how I do it. First of all, I would agree that part of the hidden curriculum of the current structure and organization of education is bringing the marketplace, bringing a corporatization, bringing business into the university and into schooling. And it's often done through the vehicles, the medium of technology, but not always. First of all, schools are being seen and organized more and more on a corporate model. They want to organize themselves for efficiency. They want to be more productive. They see corporations as the most effective and efficient organization of society, and they see the corporate model as the model for schools. Secondly, they see business corporations being restructured by technology. All right, they see the writing on the wall that AOL and Time Warner just engaged in the biggest merger in history, that we have an info economy. The business is being revolutionized by the internet, so schooling should also get on the bandwagon and be revolutionized through the internet and technology. Now, this is something we need to be wary of, something we need to be critical of, but something that we can also take advantage of in order to reconstruct education. So it's true, there's a certain corporatization of education through the internet, where AOL, through Microsoft, where the information technologies are entering into the classroom. Most infamously, Channel 1 uses the media, uses video through satellite television, VCRs and TVs to bring advertising, commercialization, the corporate agenda, the structure of the corporation into the classroom. So this one, I think, should be very critical of. On the other hand, part of being critical of it is developing critical media literacy and teaching students how to read and interpret advertisements, how to be critical of the news and journalism, to see the bias, the hidden agenda, the curricula of ads, of journalism and the news, of media, etc. So on one hand, it's a colonizing force, corporations. On the other hand, it's an opportunity to practice critical media literacy, to teach people, students, teachers, how to become critical of this corporate agenda, to expose the hidden curricula that's seeping into the classroom. But most important, I think it's important to use technology as alternative modes of pedagogy and education to take advantage of the technological revolution to reconstruct education. This, to me, is the greatest opportunity for educators, for us, to restructure education that we've had. Education has been a very conservative institution because It's been reproducing the same hierarchical social relationships, students and teachers in the classroom. It's been reproducing the same conservative curriculum, textbooks, lesson plans, grading, tests, etc., that have been pretty much the same for the last 30 or 40 years. There have been some changes in the curricula as a result of the movements of the 1960s that have brought women's history, African American history, Chicano history, Native American history, gay and lesbian history. So there's been some expansion of the curricula. There's been some bringing in alternative, multicultural voices, etc. So the curricula hasn't been completely conservative, but it's been pretty much a replication of the status quo through education. The internet, information technologies, gives the opportunity, one, to change social relations between students and teachers, where on listservs, on email, on websites, it's more interactive, where the students have more opportunities to raise their own questions, to articulate their own voices, to set up their own websites. Students can express their own views, their own cultural interests, and develop their own cultural forms through their website. They can put up pictures, they can put up video, they can write essays, etc. So this is really a change in the structure of culture that's more democratic, it's more interactive, it's more multimedia. So I see the new technologies as a positive opportunity to reconstruct education, to democratize education, to create multicultural education, as well as a danger that the corporations are going to get more power. They're going to colonize and commodify education even further. So to me, it's a contested terrain. It's a very volatile field that can go either way. So to me, there's openings and possibilities with the new technologies, as well as dangers that it's just another capitalist tool to colonize the field of education, just like corporations have taken over the political system. They've taken over the mainstream media, where Time Warner, NBC, Microsoft, AOL, CBS, General Electric, the biggest corporations, control culture now through controlling television, films, etc. They're trying to control the internet. They're trying to control education. So there is a corporatization of these new technologies. There's no question about it. But there's also democratic possibilities in the new technologies where we can use these to promote alternative pedagogies, alternative forms of education, alternative social relations, and alternative political agendas.
Anything else we want to add? Or anything else you want to add? Well, because do we have to have you there at 4:30?
No.
It was a federally funded project that we worked on, and
The hidden curriculum.
I guess I kind of got a little critical of some of our high theories, but then you have someone like Matt Drudge come along, and it really can.
It was a revolution in
Yeah,
journalism.
He's got a text site up,
Right.
A few pages of text, and
He almost overthrew a president.
yeah, that's amazing.
That's big.
So, okay, tape's rolling. Anytime.
There's a very important point I want to make vis-a-vis the internet, and that's how contradictory and ambiguous it is. On one hand, there's a lot of corporate hype that the internet is the solution to all problems of society. It's going to create new jobs, all kinds of new economic opportunities. It's going to revolutionize education, make information, education accessible to everyone. It's going to create all kinds of new cultural forms and a great new culture. It's going to revolutionize every aspect of life. It's going to give us all these great new products, etc. On one hand, I think we need to be very skeptical and not to buy into this hype. But on the other hand, I think we need to seize the possibilities and the potential that the internet creates, that the new computer and multimedia technology produce. I think we do need to see this as very important and revolutionary, that it's really changing everything. But There's a corporate agenda that wants to solve all social problems through the internet, from education to the economy, and this ain't going to happen. So in terms of the classroom and education, it's not enough just to bring technology into the classroom. Computers aren't going to solve the problems of education. The problem of the digital divide is a very real and serious one. We need to make the new technologies accessible to everyone. We need to make sure that the internet, the computer information technologies, the skills of media and computer literacy are not just transmitted to the elite. Computer culture began as a nerd culture, a white male elite culture, in which the divisions between existing class, gender, race hierarchies were going to be threatened or going to be exacerbated, made worse. The difference between the digital haves and the digital have-nots were threatening to reproduce the divisions between the class, gender, race divides that previously existed. So the internet, on one hand, is replicating the class and race and gender divisions that were already there and maybe even making them worse. On the other hand, there's the potential that they'll undermine them, that individuals that didn't have great economic opportunities, that didn't have social or cultural power, that were left out of the cultural and political game, now have opportunities through the internet, through computer and media literacy, to be players, to get good jobs, to make their voices heard, to be cultural creators, to be intellectuals, to be players and producers in the given society. So there are new opportunities. There's dangers that the internet will just replicate the previous class and gender and race divisions between the haves and the have-nots, but there's opportunities to undermine them. And here's where schools come in. It's very, very important for schooling to empower people, to give them the literacies, the competencies to be able to participate in the information revolution. And this means teaching reading and writing, giving the kind of print media literacy that's needed to be able to read and write and thus participate in the new cyber culture that has a very strong print media component, but also to be able to involve themselves in the multimedia game, to construct websites, to become computer literate, to be able to create sounds and images and being part of the visual culture of the new multimedia culture. So it's a tremendous challenge for education, and I think it's an opportunity for education to be reconstructed. We are having a technological revolution. Things are changing. It's a question whether we'll seize the opportunity, whether we'll use the technologies whether we'll use the technologies positively as a force of social change and social reconstruction, whether these will be instruments of democratization or instruments of corporatization. And it's very important for individuals and groups to resist the corporate agenda, to resist the Microsoft, AOL, Time Warner agenda, but to use the new technologies to promote democratization, to promote overcoming the digital divides. And in an ironic way, to some extent, this is being forced on the corporations. If you listen to the president of Time Warner, who I saw on television the other day after the AOL Time Warner merger, he was much more into talking about democracy and overcoming the digital divide than, say, the head of the oil corporation or the tobacco industry. I mean, these people were, the previous industrial sector corporate people, these people were villains. These people were engaged in evil predatory practices, the military-industrial complex, etc. There were few redeeming qualities of this sector of corporate capitalism. Microsoft capitalism is a softer capitalism. It has to make more concessions to democracy, to multiculturalism. So we should push them in this ways. We should take seriously their slogans about empowerment. saying, yes, we want empowerment and we want groups and individuals empowered that have been left out. We want a democratic, egalitarian society, and if you're going to have all this cultural power, you're going to have to share it with us, et cetera. And I think these new sectors of capital are more open to democracy than the previous ones were. So this requires a lot of new thinking and new ideas in order to respond in a democratic and activist and productive way to the revolution that's going on.
We asked you a little bit about this, and we touched on it a couple other times, regarding the whole issue of race and gender. You've been speaking about the new media culture that we're moving into. I'm kind of reminded of the classic cartoon that, on the internet, no one knows you're a dog.
Right.
I'm wondering, do you think where does that play in, again, within the framework of the hidden curriculum and reproducing social hierarchies? How do you, on the internet, does no one know you're a woman or a Hispanic, or do you think that's really going to happen? Or what?
I think it is happening. One issue that we haven't talked about in terms of education, the hidden curriculum, new technologies, et cetera, is the issue of identity. Okay? Previously, identities were constructed through family, through church, through school, through work, et cetera. There's always been a biological component to identity. You're born white or black, you're born of a certain race or ethnicity, you're born male and female. So there's certain biological constraints on identity. But it used to be that through schooling and again through family and church, you gained your identity through your socialization and your social interactions and the social roles you played. So you were a Catholic or a Protestant, you were a liberal or a conservative, you had a social role, you were a computer operator, or you were a factory worker, or you were a poet, etc. The schooling basically trained people for professions, for certain social roles. Your family trained you for this schooling, and the rest of the culture socialized people into certain identities. Okay, well, this is changing in cyber culture, where until we have visual culture, and someday we're going to have cameras by every computers, so almost everyone that is involved in a chat room or putting messages out on the internet, you're going to see who they are, or at least there's going to be the possibility of that. So identity won't be quite as mysterious as it is now. But we're now in a very strange, fluid situation where the traditional constructs of identity are not operative in cyber culture. This is simply a fact. We don't know if someone is man or woman, black or white, gay or straight, young or old. The traditional markers, the visible markers of identity, have been erased in cyberspace. So this is a very strange situation that most adults don't get, that haven't interacted in this culture themselves, that haven't involved themselves in moos and muds and chat rooms, that haven't involved themselves in listservs and email discussions, where identity comes through you are what you write, or you are what you do in cyberspaces. So you can really construct different alternative identities, and identity is more fluid, it's more flexible, it's more interactive, it's less determined than it is in everyday life. So this is simply a new cultural space. This is a whole new phenomenon that does have, I think, democratic possibilities, it has creative possibilities, but it's also a sphere of weirdness in which identity is simply uncertain, unstable, and strange, and requires new concepts and new understandings of how we construct our very public identities and our persona, etc. That again, I think we haven't quite figured out what to do with this.
Do you think that the internet opens up possibilities of Habermas's community action?
There's no question that the internet is creating new communities, virtual communities, new public spheres, new spaces in which people can interact on issues of public concern, be it debates about the internet itself, be it political debates, be it issues of gender or sex or whatever. All of these issues are played out in new public spaces, in new communities on the internet. And again, we haven't figured out what is a virtual community. What are the new public spaces? Are these real or imaginary? Are they important or unimportant? This is simply a new cultural space. And there's whole big debates about whether VL and virtual life or RL and real life are really where it's at, really important. I see these domains as overlapping and interacting, but in some ways as in conflict and contradictory, et cetera. So it's just requiring a whole new understanding of what is a community, what is the public space, what is democracy, what is culture, what is education. So I find the internet so important because it's throwing in question everything we previously believed. Is throwing in question, it's undermining and subverting the very spaces of public interaction, creating new modes of interaction, new cultural forms that we need to try to understand and then to make use of in a constructive and democratic way.
Well, I fear we may get kicked out of here if we don't wrap it up, so I'm sure.
Let me just say one last thing. The final thing that I want to say is that this technological revolution creates a tremendous challenge to education to develop a critical pedagogy that one uncovers the hidden curriculum, that critiques the way that schooling is organized, that tries to present alternative curricula, alternative pedagogy, alternative spaces of education, alternative forms of teaching. And I think that the internet and the new technology provides the potential to reconstruct education. It provides the possibility for alternative pedagogies, alternative cultural spaces like websites and listservs, alternative interaction. But it's important to see this as supplemental and not simply replacing the classroom, books, schooling. It's a question of developing new models of education that draws on both the new forms of pedagogy and cultural spaces of the internet and cyberspaces, but also the classroom and book culture and a more traditional form of culture. If we can bring these together, then I think we can really reconstruct education, but we need to do so democratically. We need to use education as a tool, as an instrument to overcome the divides, digital and real, between the dominant configurations of gender, race, and class power, to create a more egalitarian society and culture in which education and schools are part of a democratic reconstruction of education and society. John Dewey is perhaps the great philosopher of 20th century U.S. Society and culture because he saw the interconnection between the reconstruction of education and society, that you need to do both at once. You can't really change society without changing education. But on the other hand, the democratization of education is part and parcel of a democratization of society if education is restructured in accordance with the imperatives of democracy and not just corporate imperatives for profit, privatization, and the capitalist agenda. So I'll stop with that.
I don't want to cut you off. Do you have anything else?
That's it.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
That was great. We hope you edited well.
Well,
We had a very difficult time. I'll get that.
uh,
Editing Michael Apple.
how's